Welcome to Spread the Light, where we use the power of our own stories of living with mental illness to help dispel stereotypes and stigma, and instead spread hope and light. I'm your host, Dr. Devika Bhushan. I'm a pediatrician, a public health practitioner, a parent, an immigrant, and somebody with lived experience with bipolar disorder. Today, I'm really fortunate to be able to welcome to the show Brandon Staglin. Brandon, who many of you will know, serves as president of One Mind, which is a premier mental health advocacy organization. And there, he channels his deep experience in communications, advocacy, and his personal recovery from schizophrenia to drive brain health research, services, and media to spread healing. Welcome, Brandon, and it's so good to have you here.
Thank you, Devika. It's great to be with you here.
So tell us, Brandon, how did your mental health journey begin?
So I was diagnosed with schizophrenia when I was 18 years old, back in 1990, and it was the scariest experience I'd ever had. I had been in college for a year at that point, and I just finished my freshman year and was at my parents' home in Lafayette, California, where I grew up. And that freshman year had been very stressful for me. I had experienced a bit of a culture shock when I went to school. It was Dartmouth College, so opposite coast from where I grew up. And the culture was quite different. And I didn't feel like I fit in very well. So that was stressful for quite a while. Academics were challenging, that being an Ivy League school. And also I met my first serious girlfriend there, and we had a terrible breakup toward the end of that year. And I was actually looking for my first competitively placed job that summer, and a little stressed about that too, because I wasn't finding anything that I wanted at that time. And so all these thoughts were kind of wheeling around in my head. Am I worthy of love? Am I worthy to succeed in life? So all that stress kind of came to a head one night when I was trying to fall asleep and thinking about these things. And it was like something snapped within me. And the sensations were bizarre. It's like half of my awareness had vanished, and in its place was this dark, swirling vortex of dread. And all the emotions that I remembered feeling, all the love that I felt for my family, my friends, my ex-girlfriend, I couldn't access any of it then. And it was all unfamiliar. So that was terrifying in itself. And I was convinced pretty soon, within a few minutes, that if I let any new experiences enter through the right half of my body, like my right eye, my right ear, then a new personality would develop inside me and kind of take me over, which is also terrifying. You might call it a delusion, which is typical with schizophrenia. People experience those. Belief that something is true, which is clearly not for anyone else. And so I couldn't sleep all that night or the next 5 nights. And after that much time, I fortunately was able to get to a psychiatric hospital with the help of a friend, and checked in kind of quasi-voluntarily, because I would be committed involuntarily due to my erratic behavior if I wasn't compliant with committing myself voluntarily. So that was scary. So after a few days there at the hospital, I was trying some medications with the help of a doctor, and my parents didn't know about what had happened to me at that point. They were away on a trip in France, and they found out about it from a neighbor who'd seen me go to the hospital in an ambulance. And so they came back as soon as they heard about it and took me back home, and found a psychiatrist that I could trust after a couple of tries. And that's when my mental health journey began. My recovery began at that point, and there have been some very dark times in my early recovery, close to suicide on multiple occasions. But there were some things that kept me going in those dark times. I'd be happy to talk about those if you're interested.
Absolutely. Wow. That sounds like it must have been so terrifying. And it was 33 years ago for you now that, that pivotal set of experiences occurred, but you still remember those like they were yesterday. I'm sure they must have, imprinted in your brain in a very stark and searing way.
Yeah, I've talked about them a lot. I aim to help dispel the stigma around schizophrenia. It's still the most stigmatized mental health condition. In fact, it is actually getting worse, the stigma around schizophrenia over the last 10 years, whereas stigma around other mental health conditions, studies have shown they've actually gotten less, which is good. So sharing my story, I think, can be a way to kind of humanize the experience of somebody with schizophrenia.
Can you tell us a little bit about how that stigma has played out for you in your life and what you've seen in the last decade to make you think that it's gotten worse for schizophrenia in particular?
Yeah. So there are three types of stigma. There's self-stigma, which you feel about yourself and your condition. Typically a lot of self-shame for people. I felt a lot of that. There's also public stigma, which is what the culture influences people to feel about other people who experience mental illness. And then there's social stigma, which is where there are laws and policies that perpetuate the discrimination against people with mental health conditions. So the worst stigma for me was initially the self-stigma. And it drove me during my early recovery to not tell anybody that I knew, except for very close friends and family, about my condition at all. I was able to recover well enough to go back to college after about 6 months after my initial episode, thanks to getting treatment early. As I said, a friend helped me get to a hospital within a few days of my psychotic episode. And also thanks to the loving and dedicated support of my family, they made sure I knew that they loved me unconditionally. That gave me strength to want to continue working for my own recovery. And also staying involved with the community, doing things that mattered to me and that were meaningful for others as well, gave me a sense of purpose. So those three things, plus the ambition that I had to continue on in my career of college and then a career beyond in engineering, which is what I aspired to do, drove me to recover and go back to college. So back at college, I told nobody about my condition due to the stigma that I felt. And I was constantly policing my thoughts and my feelings and my behaviors as if any weirdness leaked out, that people would know what happened to me that summer or figure it out, and they would ostracize me. I figured they wouldn't want to be my friends anymore. And so I was very scared about that. And that was exhausting, thinking that all the time. And so I ended up isolating a little bit more than I should have and spending a lot of time studying, which got my grades back up, but it was not good for my mental health and well-being. So that was the self-stigma. Around cultural stigma or public stigma, it's been a little bit less. There have been some times during my second episode recovery in the mid-1990s when I was trying to make new friends again, and because I had been out of the social loop for a while during the recovery from that episode, and stretching my wings into new social circles. And my story had been kind of public at that point. My family had founded One Mind in 1995, inspired by our shared experience with my schizophrenia, to fund and improve research for new treatments for the condition. So my story had been published in the newspaper when they covered One Mind and our music festival for brain health event, which is something that's well known in the Bay Area and around the country now. So because my story was known, the new people in my social circle, some of them were discriminatory, some of them made fun of me and played jokes on me and things. And I felt marginalized. I felt ashamed. I felt like, are these really friends? Maybe they're not. And so all the hope that I had to make those friends had kind of been dashed at that point. But more recently, I figured out how to overcome stigma by speaking about my condition with conviction and framing it as a strength. I find that when I speak about it matter-of-factly and highlight what I've learned from my experiences with the condition, people are much more receptive and appreciative that I'm sharing and ask me a lot of questions. They're very interested. They want to learn more about that. And actually, I applied to graduate school in 2017 to get a Master of Science in Healthcare Administration and Interprofessional Leadership at UCSF. And at that point, I was debating with myself, shall I disclose on my application that I live with schizophrenia? And I did.
Question. Yeah. We all deal with that as we apply to different kinds of positions and programs of study.
Absolutely. And so I said, I'm all in, I'm going to do this. And so I framed it as a strength and highlighted what I learned from my condition and how it would help me, be a better healthcare leader. And it worked. I got in a very supportive faculty and cohort that I was with, and great experience there at UCSF. So leading now as president of One Mind, I have this platform that I can share with others. And thank you for inviting me to your podcast to do that today.
That's just such a wonderful set of lessons that you've taken. And I know we're going to dive into those lessons a little bit further, but that reframe of a really difficult experience as really driving your strengths and superpowers, I think is a really important way for us to not only dissolve our own self-stigma, but really help to dissolve the other layers of stigma that you spoke about. So that stigma of the public as well as the structural stigma. Both of those are able to be touched and affected into positive directions when we are honest and give the whole story, right? Not just what it looks like when we're ill, but also what it looks like when we are in recovery and we've harnessed some strengths from that journey. And it's interesting, actually, last year the Lancet published a piece on stigma, and they broke down stigma as just as you did. So the self-stigma that you spoke about, the public stigma and the structural stigma were named there. And then they added a new kind of stigma to at least my way of thinking about this, which was stigma by association. So this is the stigma that family members, friends, even care providers of those who have mental health conditions, sort of the cloud or the darkness that touches them by association as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, to pick up on a thread that you put down a little bit ago about how you feel like with schizophrenia in particular, unlike for other mental health conditions, stigma has been on the rise in the last few years rather than on the decline. I'm curious to know, where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, I think there are the three main reasons for that. Number one is that the media typically blames mental illness often for violence that takes place in society, media and certain sectors of the political sphere, and that can perpetuate discrimination against people with mental illness. There's passed some new laws last year to improve mental health care for young people and so forth. That was great, but a gun safety law kind of tacked onto that, and so does that send the right message? Not really. And so I think seeing these repeated accounts and reinforcements that mental illness can lead to violence, which is not exactly true. I mean, people in treatment for mental illness, when they're getting good treatment, typically are no more violent than any other part of society. And it's more likely that somebody's going to be the victim of violence if they live with a mental illness than to be violent themselves. So I think that's important to understand. And then secondly, I think that psychosis, which is a key feature of schizophrenia, that's the hallucinations that people experience, like seeing or hearing things that aren't actually there. The delusions, like believing things, as I mentioned earlier, that are not understandable by anyone else in the world. Those are really hard for people to understand and identify with. And so they kind of lead to a sense of othering of people who experience these things. A good friend of mine, who I see regularly, lives with schizophrenia as well. He said that the worst part about psychosis is that you can't share your experiences with anyone. Because no one understands. So psychosis is scary for that reason to people who don't know about it. And then the third factor is something that one of my director of clinical programs, Irene Herford, has mentioned, and I believe this is true. She is a psychiatrist. It works with lots of young people dealing with psychosis. And her idea is that when we encounter somebody with psychosis, if we haven't experienced it ourselves, it still underlines that everyone's grip on reality is a little bit tenuous. And by seeing that kind of writ large in somebody that you're encountering, that lack of grip on reality it highlights for you that maybe your grip on reality is not that strong. Because we're all human in one way or another. And so I think that unsettles people when they see that. So I think all those things contribute to the stigma around schizophrenia being particularly strong and getting worse.
Yeah, those are some really difficult to combat factors because some of them are outside of our locus of control because of what sells in terms of headlines, what narratives are prevalent already and are gaining steam, and also this idea that seeing somebody be so unwell, for instance, might actually pull at some of the most core fears and vulnerabilities that each of us hold, right? And the easiest way to put away those fears for ourselves is to other that experience and those people. So absolutely. Thank you for giving voice to that so eloquently.
You're welcome.
I'm curious if you look back at some of the hardest segments of your journey, which you've alluded to and spoken about in other places. What is one thing that you would have told yourself then, knowing what you know now?
I mentioned that there have been some really dark times in my early recovery from schizophrenia when I was seriously considering ending my life and just feeling really dark, like there was no hope to get out of this dark hole that I was in, that maybe no future that I could believe in or look forward to. And what I would have told myself is that there is still a ton of potential in life, even with a schizophrenia diagnosis, and that there's a lot to learn from experiences with a severe mental illness, like with many types of adversity. And I think that if I had known that then, it would have bolstered my hope. And I would have wanted to tell myself about all the great things I could have experienced, and in fact have experienced since then, by holding on and continuing on with my dreams and plans and goals, and continuing to be a part of a family, part of a circle of friends, part of a community. All these areas of belonging are strengthening and give people meaning in their lives, including me. And so I actually wrote a song about recovery from schizophrenia. It's called Horizons Left to Chase. I performed it on guitar at 4 different venues around the country in 2017, including a Mental Health America's conference, our own music festival for brain health, and 2 other events. It's all about potential that remains in life, or even is amplified in life after a severe mental illness diagnosis. I hope that inspires many people.
So what are some of the ways in which your journey has shaped your unique superpowers?
So I think that I've learned a lot of compassion that I had previous to my diagnosis. When I was growing up, I was very ambitious, as I mentioned. I wanted to help humanity. I believed that God had a plan for humanity. I couldn't necessarily comprehend it, but I wanted to be a part of it and to help humanity to do better in the universe. In fact, my goal was to build the world's first starship. So that was my technically oriented goal. But now I was like looking upward to the heavens for inspiration. But now I'm looking more inward to the heart and into other people, and try and build my empathy for others. And I think I've been able to do that to some degree. And it means a lot to help people with their health and with their well-being. People know that I'm there for them, like people that I work with, or for my wife, there for my family. That means the world to me that I can do that and be there for them. It gives me a strong sense of identity and meaning. So I think that's one of my greatest strengths, is the compassion that I can feel. And on top of that, the conviction that there can be a better world. There can be a better life for people who experience serious mental illness. I've been able to grow into such a life, and I feel very fortunate that I have been able to do that. Great. It shouldn't be a lucky thing. It should be a commonplace thing that when somebody develops a schizophrenia or any other severe mental illness like bipolar disorder, whatever it may be, that recovery can be within their reach. So I'm working hard to make that a reality, and that gives me a sense of purpose too.
Amen. And what's one mental health myth that you would like to bust? You've busted a couple already around serious mental illness and violence, for instance, but if there's one other one that you want to point to.
Sure. Well, I would want to emphasize that even a schizophrenia diagnosis is not a death sentence. It doesn't mean you're sidelined for the rest of your life. As I was talking about a moment ago, I think that's a really important thing to understand, that recovery can happen and that people who experience schizophrenia are human beings. To paraphrase my friend Ellen Sachs, wonderful advocate who wrote The Center Cannot Hold My Journey Through Madness. She's a law professor at USC who lives with schizophrenia. To paraphrase her wonderful quote from that book, the humanity that brings us together is more important than the mental illnesses that may make us different. And I really think that's a wonderful thing to remember. We're all human.
That's beautiful. And today, as you look at your life, and you've lived with this diagnosis and you've been in recovery for 3 decades and more, what have you figured out for staying well, your top 3 takeaways?
So there are 3 main things that I do every day. One is to exercise every morning. That lifts my mood and gets my brain active for the day. Many people swear by that for their mood, and also physical fitness. Second thing is getting enough sleep. And so this is a typical thing for people. It's not a fun, exciting thing to talk about, but it is definitely something that makes a difference. I find that when I get too little sleep repeatedly, I can't process information very well. I can't make good decisions, and I can't relate to people with the kind of empathy that I like to. So life is a lot better when I get enough sleep. And then thirdly is I meditate every morning. And that gives me a sense that anything is possible. It kind of quiets my mind and gets me open to the possibilities of the day. So those are all three things that I do that make a difference for me every single day. People, including me, who experience better social connection are happier in general, and having those connections makes a big difference for me as well.
I absolutely agree. In my own life too, these ways of restructuring how we relate to ourselves, to the world, to the people around us, to be able to stay as well as possible for as long as possible. Those are fundamental restructurings of lots of daily habits. And so just to round us out and send us off with a message of hope, potentially, how do you think about our collective future and what really excites you, either at One Mind or in general in the world?
Yeah, I'm excited that there is so much momentum building for change in the mental health sphere, and that things are beginning to happen more and more readily and consistently for change and improvements in the healthcare system. One Mind is about to launch our One Mind Accelerator program, which will help entrepreneurs who are launching startups to help people with serious mental illness. We'll have 10 companies out of over 100 applicants who are innovating for new solutions for people who are struggling with these mental illnesses. And when a company gets behind a problem, it can access more funding than a nonprofit typically can. So this is our way of accelerating our impact as a nonprofit by helping startups to accelerate their impact. And I am very excited that we've already picked some of the companies that'll be in the cohort, and excited to talk more about that when that happens. But I think when government and nonprofits and private industry can work together, we can make a big difference for people who are struggling with mental illness. And I'm excited to be a part of that.
That's really exciting. We'll stay tuned for that date to learn more. Thank you so much, Brandon, for sharing your deep wisdom and insights with us here today, and for everything that you do to spread the light with your work and the person that you are. Really appreciate you.
You're welcome, Devika. Thank you for doing this podcast and spreading a light as well. It's a great service you do for everyone.
Thank you.